The heavens split apart above Millennium Prime, like torn flesh in reality itself. Bleeding red light that washed the ash-colored plains in a sickly glow. Imperial guardsmen froze mid-battle, lace guns trembling in their hands as something fell from the rupture. Not the shrieking spawn of chaos, not the cursed silhouettes of demonic wings, but a single figure descending in flame, brighter than the dying sun. Commissar Farthest raised his magnoculars, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Incoming anomaly, ready, firing lines." But the order died as the figure struck the no-man's land between Imperial and Heretic trenches. The impact rolled across the field like the wrath of a god. Tanks flipped, men were hurled screaming through the air, and a crater half a kilometer wide replaced the killing zone. Silence followed, the kind that weighed heavier than death. Then the dust parted. In its center stood a man, barefoot, clad in torn orange garments marked with alien sigils. His hair spiked upward in defiance of gravity, glinting beneath the crimson light. He looked around with childlike confusion, his expression calm in a world that had never known calm. "Where am I?" His voice carried across the battlefield, clear and unfiltered, slicing through vox static and helmet seals alike. Psychers convulsed as they heard it, their souls scraping against something that wasn't warp-born, yet vibrated with divine resonance. "This isn't Earth," he murmured. The 84th Millennium Regiment opened fire. 10,000 lasbolts converged in a storm of crimson death. The figure disappeared, not evaporated, simply wasn't there. Then he reappeared beside the commissar, head tilted, examining the officer's sidearm as if it were a toy. "That wasn't very nice," he said, smiling. "I'm Goku. Do you know where I am? And why is everyone fighting?" The commissar drew his chainsword in reflex, the teeth screaming to life. He swung, the blade halted between two fingers. The stranger frowned softly. "You shouldn't play with dangerous toys," he said, bending the weapon until the blessed adamantine curled like parchment. "Someone could get hurt." Panic spread through the ranks, something almost unknown to Millennium discipline. Veterans who'd faced demons without trembling dropped their weapons and ran. Others screamed prayers as the cultists across the trench line fell to their knees, proclaiming the coming of an avatar. "The gods have sent their champion!" The words echoed through the smoky wind. Above them, aboard the strike cruiser Emperor's Vow, Librarian Cassius of the Ultramarines clutched his temples as psychic static clawed at his mind. "Captain," he rasped, blood trickling from his eyes. "Something has breached real space on Millennium Prime. Not demon, not warp. It reads as human." Captain Amon's face was carved from stone. "Prepare for immediate deployment. If it threatens Imperial order, we erase it." 3. Thunderhawks roared into the atmosphere, carrying 40 Terminators of the First Company. They landed in formation around the crater, ceramite boots crushing ash and bone. Goku stood at the center, surrounded by the aftermath of chaos he hadn't caused but couldn't stop. "Are you in charge?" he asked Amon, recognizing the leader's presence instinctively. "I need help finding home, and maybe stopping all this fighting." Amon leveled his stormbolter. "In the name of the Emperor, submit to Imperial custody. Resist and you die." Goku scratched his head. "You people really don't like talking first, huh?" Fire! 40 stormbolters unleashed their wrath. The air became solid with explosive rounds, a storm meant to obliterate tanks. The explosions faded. Goku stood untouched within a glowing field of light. The bolts hung motionless around him, frozen in mid-air. "I said I don't want to fight," he said, voice calm, but carrying hidden weight. "But I won't let you hurt me." Cassius extended his staff, lightning flaring as warp energy screamed toward Goku. The blast shattered against the barrier like a wave against diamond. "That tickled," Goku said, surprised. "You're using energy, but not like mine." Amon barked orders, Terminators charging with thunder hammers and power fists. The ground shook beneath them. Goku stepped aside with blurring grace, catching a hammer mid-swing. "This is really well made," he noted, blocking blows faster than augers could track. "But you're relying too much on your armor, not enough on yourselves." "Blasphemy!" a Terminator spat. The The Codex Astartes is perfection. Nothing's perfect, Goku replied softly. That's why we train. With one effortless motion, he pushed the giant back, sending the warrior sliding through the dirt unharmed but humiliated, more charged, none connected. Enough, Aemon roared. Librarian, orbital bombardment. Goku's tone changed. You'd kill your own men just to erase me? Acceptable losses, Aemon replied without hesitation. The Imperium endures. The air grew heavy. Dust rose in a spiraling vortex as golden light began to pour from Goku's skin. You'd sacrifice the innocent for control, he said, voice deepening. I've heard that before. The light burst outward, blinding. When it cleared, his hair burned gold, his aura roaring like a living sun. This is called Super Saiyan, he said, the ground trembling underfoot. I warned you I didn't want to fight. Psychers screamed as reality bent around his energy, the warp itself recoiling. Bolters melted. Vox channels died. One heartbeat later, 40 Astartes fell unconscious where they stood. Only Aemon remained, his storm bolter crumpled in Goku's hand. You're strong, Aemon admitted quietly. Too strong. I just want to understand this place, Goku said, setting the weapon down gently. Maybe you can help me. The captain was about to answer when the sky screamed. Clouds blackened, alive with pestilence. The air thickened with decay. Warp breach, gasped Cassius, barely conscious. Massive, demonic incursion. A shadow fell across the battlefield, vast and rotting. A voice rolled through the clouds like thunder soaked in filth. I am Mortarion, son of Nurgle, and you, Golden One, have drawn my gaze. Flies swarmed thick as smoke. Goku's golden aura met the stench of death head-on. You smell awful, he said, frowning. And your energy, it's wrong. Mortarion's laughter was a contagion. You will kneel before the gifts of decay. Not happening, Goku said, planting his feet. But I'll give you a chance to walk away. The demon Primarch raised his scythe. Then die, fool! Mortarion came on like a collapsing night, scythe low, plague smoke coiling as if the air itself had grown lungs and began to rot. The blade carved a trench through reality, and Goku rose over it in a clean jump, only to be swallowed by a fog of spores that clawed at his skin and eyes with eager mouths. He coughed once, set his stance, and flared his aura until the gold turned white at the edges and the poison burned away like frost under noon's sun. That is filthy, he said, and it is not strength. Mortarion's laugh made corpses twitch as if remembering their fear. Strength is survival and surrender to what devours all things. The scythe whistled back across the ground, and the impact cratered stone where Goku had been. The Saiyan reappeared at Mortarion's flank and drove a short punch into the plating of the Primarch's chest. Warp-forged ceramite screamed and split in a spidering line, and for the first time, the reek of rot faltered. Mortarion answered with a tide of Nurglings and plague-bearers that shouldered one another to reach the heat of Goku's light. They broke on him in handfuls. Each strike of his fists sent out clean shockwaves that scoured corruption from the air. Each kick erased a clutch of chanting throats into green steam. Your energy does not belong here, the demon Primarch observed, moving with impossible grace for something so ruined. It is not warp, and it is not matter, and yet it unthreads my sons. Goku read the rhythm of the attacks like a streambed reads the water. Mortarion never wasted motion. Every step closed an angle to herd the target toward the path of silence. The scythe came again, not as metal but as an absence, the edge thirsty for the idea of life rather than the body that held it. Goku deflected with a forearm layered in ki and still felt a cold bite slide through him, as if someone had written his name in winter and asked the season to erase the rest. The cut on his arm was a black little sun that tried to drink his warmth. He pulled breath into his gut, closed his eyes in the middle of a storm of claws, and pushed Kai into the wound until his own cells remembered who they were. The dark rings smoked, then guttered out. "That is better," he said, "but you are not." Mortarion gathered the storm, bells tolling in distant churches that had never existed, furnaces opening in his armor to vomit clouds of living plague. Goku narrowed his stance and let the golden mantle climb into his hair, until every spike carried lightning. The ground fractured in radiating circles, and the sky flashed like a pupil closing. Super Saiyan was no longer enough. He climbed again, with a low, long exhale. The aura sharpened to an electric crown, and the shockwave traveled for kilometers. Glass blew out of dead hab blocks, and the trenches buckled. Mortarion steadied himself with a contemptuous dig of silence into the soil. "Interesting," he said, "then die properly." The scythe swept in a pattern that did not honor distance or time. The stroke began behind Goku and arrived in front of him, and the second beat followed inside the first, with a disagreeable logic. Goku answered with speed so pure it bent the echo. One hand on the haft, a knee inside Mortarion's guard, a rising elbow that cracked a pauldron like a tomb lid. The demon Primarch reeled back half a stride, and the flies screamed their disapproval. "You talk about surrender because you forgot how to grow," Goku said. "And there is no honor in that." Mortarion spat a cataract of phlegm that ate a boulder to slush and stepped through it. Silence came down in a vertical line. The world tried to separate along the mark. Goku vanished and reappeared above and behind, his palms already cupped at his hip. The blue seed of the wave brightening until the air hummed around it. The wordless chant in his chest became sound, the syllables stacking old as oceans. Kamihami. Mortarion hurled a continent of green fire to smother it, and the beam split the tide down the middle and kept going. The scythe met it point first, and for a heartbeat the material universe and the Immaterium disagreed. Then silence cracked from tip to crook, and the fracture ran down the demon weapon like lightning in dry wood. Mortarion roared and pushed with all the malignant charity of his god. The Kamehameha only grew brighter. It was not warp. It was not prayer. It was the simple refusal of life to be eaten quietly, given shape and aim. The beam took the Primarch full on and drove him backward in a straight line. Armor peeled, flesh boiled. Corruption tried to bloom in reverse and found no soil. The massive shape dissolved into greasy streamers that the light burned to nothing as they fled. The clouds above tore open and a pale sun looked at a dead world, as if it could remember gentler weather. Goku lowered his hands slowly, shoulders trembling, the electric crown unspooling into the quieter gold of the first form, and then thinning further until only breath fogged in the cooling air. "That cost more than it should," he murmured. "Whatever this place is, it drags at my energy like a tide." On the ridge, Captain Amon stood with his blade lowered and all, that iron discipline hiding a small, clean astonishment by any doctrine. "You should be a threat to be ended," he said, "yet you just banished a demon Primarch that buys you words." Goku smiled without triumph. "Can we stop shooting while we use them?" Amon would have answered, the yes almost pulled from him against the grain of training and scripture. But the ground began to jump in heavy, regular beats. Dust plumes rose in ranks, and a chorus of throats that had no use for harmony assembled the only word they loved. Wah! A green tide rolled over the horizon, 1,000 banners cut from things that once breathed. Engines built by intuition and blasphemy belched smoke. At their head came a monster in welded plates with a power claw big enough to hold an ox like a sandwich. He pointed it at the golden speck that had made the sky explode and bared his teeth in joy. "You little yellow light, you made the big flash. You is fight. We fight now." The orcs answered themselves with animal applause. Amon's gauntlet clenched. "Orcs, and that is a war boss of unusual size. We cannot hold this field with my brothers down." Goku flexed his fingers, the joints popping like distant hail. "Are they honorable fighters?" Amon blinked at the word in this place. "They are simple and terrible. They want the biggest fight, and they want it now. They will break the galaxy to get it." "Good," Goku said. "Honest is easier to read than rot." He stepped out from the crater and walked toward the oncoming wall as if descending to a shore. The war boss stopped at a respectful distance for something. His size and squinted. "You look small, but you is loud. Show Grimto your biggest." Goku drew breath, let a thin, gold edge return to his hair, and nodded. "I am tired, but I like a clean match." The orcs howled approval that shook old masonry into powder. Somewhere behind them, new signatures flared, silver shapes translating in with ritual precision. The air tasted of sanctified ozone and stern intent. The Grey Knights had arrived and their leader was already raising a runed halberd and calling the anomaly to heal in the Emperor's name. Goku held up one hand without looking back. Not yet. Not them. One fight at a time. The war boss stomped forward, grinning wider. "That is right. First we see who is day's strongest, green or gold." The ground hummed beneath their feet as two kinds of joy met in the center of a dying world, and everyone else on the field forgot to breathe while they watched fate choose a language. Grimto came like a falling boulder with ideas, the power claw humming with a hungry field as he brought it down in a chop meant to split a tank. Goku met it with a forearm wrapped in a tight skin of Kai, and the impact rang out across the flats like struck iron. Dust lifted in a circle and the nearest orc banners snapped from the wave. "You hit hard," Goku said. "Good." The war boss laughed from somewhere behind his tusks and shoved. The boot churned earth. Goku yielded half a step and the claw scythed across in a backhand that would have pulped a dreadnought. He slipped inside the arc and answered with a 3-beat combination to the ribs that hammered dents into crude armor and pushed the bigger body back on its heels. The horde roared approval. The noise carried a pressure of its own. A superstition made physics wagsh built around them like weather. The more they loved the fight, the stronger their champion became. Grimto swelled in small ways as minutes passed. The tendons thickened, the eyes burned brighter red. He laughed when Goku's next blow landed and answered with a shoulder check that sent the Saiyan skidding a furrow and up onto his toes. "You get better when it hurts," Goku said. "Me too." He let the gold climb and held it just shy of the crown, conserving what this universe stole with every breath. He moved faster, not to end it, but to learn. Each exchange taught him the orc's timing, how the claw dragged and then snapped forward, how the axe hand twitched before a feint, how a headbutt announced itself in the set of the shoulders. He struck Grimto across the jaw with enough force to make mountains ask questions, and the war boss staggered, shook himself like a wet beast, and grinned wider. "Best fight Grimto has had. Make it bigger." The horde howled that into reality. Their joy heaped onto their leader like armor plates. The next charge came with surprising footwork. An ugly little sidestep that stole angle from Goku's counter. The claw kissed the edge of his aura and set teeth on edge with a shower of 6 sparks. He answered by vanishing and reappearing inside guard to drive a palm up under the sternum. The shockwave rolled outward and threw a ring of boys into an untidy heap. Grimto coughed a laugh and swung the axe in a flat arc that Goku bent beneath. Dust streaks on his guy, breath even, eyes bright. Around them, Ultramarines watched in tight disbelief, and the Grey Knights formed a silver circle beyond the green one. Justicar Thorn's halberd at rest, but angled like a sentence about to be spoken. "Hold," Aemon said. On a private channel, the Psykers could taste. "Let this play. Something in it is holding the greenskins together and away from us." The duel went on until time lost its corners. Each minute bricked on the next, into an arena of shot craters and broken banners. Goku's knuckles bled and healed and bled again. His energy paced itself to this world's hunger. Grimto grew until the plates of his armor creaked with pride, and the ground complained under his steps. At last the war boss planted his boots and lifted the claw and axe to the sky. "One hit," he bellowed. "Winner takes all." Goku nodded once and drew breath. The aura rose and steadied, not blazing, but perfect in its line. They came together in a straight run that made the air waver. The first contact was soundless, and then the sound arrived late and heavy, a continent-wide drum. Light flashed, The circle of orcs flattened as if pressed by a giant hand, and the silver line braced with storm shield discipline to keep their feet. When the smoke folded back, there was a new crater inside the old one, and Grimto lay in it on his back, laughing like a child in rain, before his eyes rolled and he slept with the smile still attached. Goku stood above him with his hands loose and the gold shredding away into plain breath. The horde stared in a silence that had no words for grief or shame. Then something in their animal parliament voted with its lungs, and the shout rose from 1,000 throats. "New boss!" The chant took the sky. "New boss, strongest leads." Goku shook his head. "I do not want your throne. I wanted your best." A big knob with a welded arm and a veteran's squint pushed to the front and scratched his scalp with a claw. "Rules is rules," he explained with the patience of a teacher to a clever but nervous child. "You won. You is the boss. You say where we fight." Goku looked over the sea of eager faces and then past them to the silver line and the blue line and the broken trenches where humans still hid from all of this with their hands over their ears. "No civilians," he said. "You fight warriors who want to fight, not people who cannot answer you." The Nob looked pained, as if asked to invent a new color, and then nodded slowly. "Squishies is boring anyway. Too quick. No songs." A cold voice cut the moment with the precision of a blade drawn in a chapel. "Anomaly, submit to holy custody." The Grey Knights teleported without smoke or theatre. They were simply there. A circle of mirrored scripture and quiet murder. Justicar Thorn's helm turned minutely. His presence filled the space like a verdict. "By writ of the Inquisition, you will come now for examination, and the purge of this infestation will proceed." The orcs reached for weapons as if they had all been practicing the same move since birth. The silver circle flexed, wards glowed. Aemon stepped one pace forward with the dignity of a man stealing seconds in a life of orders. "Justicar," he said. Low enough for command vox, but loud enough for fate. The Golden One banished Mortarion. "He is not a category in your book." Thorn did not lower the halberd. "That is precisely why he must be contained. Power unruled is the root of heresy." Goku stood between all of them and lifted his hand palm out until the room that was a battlefield remembered a gentler shape. "I will go," he said. "But you leave them where they stand for now. They are listening, and that matters." Thorn's helm hid his eyes, but the tilt carried reluctance like a taste. The vox in his skull chimed with authority from far away, and more ancient than his oaths. And after a pause, he gave the smallest of nods. Temporary suspension of purge approved. Strategic priority supersedes. The Nob thumped his chest plate with his claw and offered a salute that had once meant respect for another boss, before words learned names for gestures. "We wait for boss," he declared loudly, so that the instinct of the crowd could hear the idea. "We guard our bit, we sharpen teeth. When boss comes back, we go where the big fights live." Goku pointed at the sleeping mountain of green in the crater. "Tell him it was close and good." The Nob grinned. "He will like that." The circle of silver contracted. A beacon unfolded like a flower from a gauntlet, and light gathered itself into a column. Aemon looked at Goku with a soldier's tired honesty. "On Macragge there is a lord who thinks before he kills. If any human can help you, it is he." Goku nodded. "I will talk, and I will listen, and I will not be chained to hurt the harmless." Thorn's silence was assent engraved on steel. The light climbed. The field dissolved. The ash plains and the chanting and the sleeping warboss fell away, and Goku appeared inside a ship that felt less like a machine and more like a cathedral taught to travel. The air smelled of oils and incense, and old fear dried into discipline. A woman in black robes waited with a gaze like a ledger and an icon at her throat that stared back. "I am Inquisitor Vale," she said without ceremony. "You have stirred the galaxy. You will be fed, and then questioned, and then carried to the Lord of Ultramar." Goku's stomach, having remembered itself, spoke before his mouth. Food would be great. Vale allowed herself the smallest curl of a smile that did not touch policy. Very well. Eat and tell me where you came from, and why the warp hates your light. The doors opened on halls big enough to teach giants humility, and the black ship bore them toward a meeting that would teach two universes how to misunderstand each other with respect. Vale watched him eat like a tactician watches a map, every answer pinned and cross-referenced as Goku spoke between plates about an Earth that was not this Earth, about Dragon Balls that bent death back into life with rules that kept the universe honest, about gods of destruction and angels who treated galaxies like a chessboard and still taught patience, about ki that was life's music tuned through will and practice, rather than the howling of the warp. She wrote in clean strokes and asked about limits and safeguards and whether his power answered to emotion or discipline. Both, he said, but discipline keeps emotion from turning into ruin. She nodded once as if shelving a dangerous book and led him through corridors that treated humans like ornament beside machines that sang litanies without voices. They entered the warp with the ritual of a religion that knew its god ate its priests. Wards flared, bells chimed. The ship shook as something outside tried the doors with soft hands and went away hungry. Goku trained in vaulted chambers, while inquisitorial acolytes measured his breath, and the librarius borrowed his movements with their eyes. He learned that Kai recovered slowly here, as if the air taxed it. He learned to save his crown for necessity and sharpen the base instead. Vale returned each day with questions about mercy and command, and whether he would fight for a banner that sometimes burned its own cities to warm its myths. I will fight for people, he said, not symbols, and she did not argue. Macragge rose like order taught to be stone and water. The fortress of Hera opened like a book that had never been wrong. Ultramarines formed corridors of blue and gold that made air into a ceremony. Aemon guided him through with the formality of a man delivering a weapon to a vault. And then the Primus Strategium swallowed the procession. And the war room fell quiet as the sun set when the Primarch turned. Rabuta Guilliman did not need trumpets. His presence built its own music. His eyes weighed Goku in a single look and found both trouble and utility. So, he said with a voice that could have been a verdict and chose to be a welcome, "You are the one who banished Mortarion. You have moved pieces on the board." "I have studied all my lives. Sit." Goku sat without bowing and without insolence, and they spoke in a side chamber where the noise of war stayed outside like rain at a monastery door. Guilliman asked about ki with the curiosity of a builder offered a new tool. Goku explained in plain words. The Primarch asked about resurrection, and his gaze went far into a past that still held him by the throat. Goku spoke of limits and balance and why power that fixed everything turned everything to ash. Guilliman listened, and then surprised a room that had not heard it often by admitting the Imperium was broken in places so old, no one remembered the cracks forming. "I will not ask you to be my hammer," he said, "but I will ask you to help when help is just." Goku agreed on the condition that civilians were not the price of strategy. The Primarch accepted with the grace of a commander who has envied clean lines his entire life. Time compressed into training and observation, and a handful of interventions that became stories before the blood dried. Grey Knights learned to shape blessings along the edges of a stance they did not have words for. Mechanicus adepts recited catechisms over oscilloscopes and named a new harmonic after a saint and a sin at once. On Mordian, the orcs fought chaos because the yellow boss had told them good fights lived there, and for once a plague host found itself unwelcome among greenskins. Then the universe tugged a thread. Goku woke from meditation with a taste of home in his mouth. Bulma was out there with wires in her hair and math in her hands, and the feeling of her mind moved along his kai like a sparrow steps along a fence. Togurius built a circle of wards and logic and told him he would have 30 seconds if the warp behaved like a gentleman. It did not, but they had enough. Contact bloomed for a breath, and Goku sent pictures and constants and warnings. A blueprint came back living inside his memory like a song that had not been written here. The Mechanicus peeled it out with gloved minds and and set to work while the High Lords argued about property and providence and who would own the door when it was built. When the ring finally stood, it hummed like a hive of careful wasps, and the air at its center spun itself into a corridor that tasted like the first day of summer. Goku stepped forward and stopped as the sweetness sharpened into something with a long nose for fate. "Wait," he said. "Something is wrong." The light curdled. Blue went to violet, went to bruise. The floor under the ring learned how to despair. The sabotage that had taken months moved from whisper to song, and the portal opened not on home, but on the crystal labyrinth, and the architect of fate sent servants wrapped in geometries that mocked Euclid to announce his interest. Kairos Fateweaver named himself, with two voices that never agreed except now. Guilliman's sword became sunrise, and the grey nights locked into a litany that hurt ears that loved lies. Goku did not wait. He threw himself through the wound after the greater demon, as if chasing a thief into a burning house. Inside the labyrinth, direction apologized and left. Stairs led to years, and rooms wore faces, and doors opened onto the idea of doors. Kairos recovered and cast equations that turned certainties to soup. Goku answered with the one certain thing he owned: movement. He closed and struck, and the staff broke its first arrogance on his fist. Then the voice that had been the wind here spoke from everywhere and nowhere, and the color of the world turned into thought. Zench offered education that never stopped, and power that never ended, and godhood the way a spider offers silk to a fly. Serve for a while. 1,000 years keeps you busy. We grant knowledge. We grant the end of your small hungers. We grant you opponents that crack galaxies with their teeth. Goku listened like a man at a market listening to a flute that plays hunger. Then he shook his head. Real teachers do not bribe, and real gods do not need slaves. You feed on fear and vanity and the need to skip the hard parts. I will not be your story. The labyrinth's smile became teeth, and the offer became punishment. Kiros called legions that were also ideas. The landscape reconfigured itself to fold him into a shape it could eat. Goku stood in the center of a theater built to devour him and became very still. The aura that had been a banner drew in until it was a thread. He placed 2 fingers to his forehead and spoke softly to something no one else could hear. Instant transmission was a path that needed a signature to anchor it. Here, he found none he could trust. So he chose one that every universe understood. Home. Not a place, not coordinates, a promise. Faces around a table, a gravity that pulls you toward who you are. The god reached with 1,000,000 clever hands and touched nothing because there was nothing to grab. Goku was a memory that decided to belong somewhere else. He vanished like a word corrected mid-sentence, and the labyrinth howled as a plan unspooled. The portal on the Forge world collapsed in on itself like a lung that remembered drowning. The demons shredded. Under silver liturgies and the Emperor's sword, the cost was high and recorded with care. Guilliman stood amid wreckage that smelled of ozone and old blood, and asked a librarian if the anomaly lived. Elsewhere, my lord. Not gone, not eaten, simply not here. The Primarch closed his eyes for one breath, then began issuing orders that turned grief into work. Record his methods. Teach what can be taught. Change what can be changed. Somewhere beyond the reach of catechism and ruin, a man opened his eyes in a place that fit the shape of his heart. Bulma cried and hit him and hugged him. Vegeta grunted and went to train as if the universe could taste his back. Time moved as it always does. The story became a thing told in mess halls and bunkers. On Macragge, young sergeants drilled forms that put breath where dogma had been. On Mordian orcs still told each other to fight like the Yellow Boss, and aimed their joy at enemies that could take a punch. The Inquisition tried to bottle the tale, and found it leaked through fingers because hope is a solvent. Guilliman stood sometimes with his hands on the rail and looked at the void, and thought of a father who had refused worship and a stranger who had refused chains, and he allowed himself the treason of a wish. That power might serve people rather than monuments. In a quieter universe, Goku sometimes paused on a ridge at sunset and thought of a demigod made of duty and a woman who asked hard questions. and a green giant who laughed at pain. And he trained with a new patience, understanding that strength meant more when it guarded the small, unremarkable miracles that make a life. In the grim darkness, where there is only war, the legend of the Golden Warrior survived censors and sermons and the long teeth of despair, a brief, clean flame remembered by soldiers who had seen too much and by children who had not yet learned how heavy a sky could be. It said that something from outside the game had stepped onto the board and left a fingerprint shaped like a better way to stand. It said that even in a universe that ate its saints, there could be a punch that banished a Primarch and a word that stopped a purge, and a choice that walked out of a god's mouth. And sometimes that was enough to make a man hold the line for one more minute. And sometimes 1 minute is where empires are saved. After the ring's failure, the Forge world learned how to count its dead with quiet hands, and the Mechanicus wrote a new litany that forbade certain alloys from meeting certain geometries because fate liked to hide intolerances. Inquisitor Vale presented her report to rooms that did not enjoy being surprised, and said the words anomaly, allied voluntarily, and restraint achieved by negotiation, and some of the oldest men in the Imperium forgot to breathe for a heartbeat. The ecclesiarchy thundered at the heresy of a mortal who refused to kneel, and then the sermons learned a careful shape in places where soldiers had fought beside a golden stranger and come home. On Macruggy, a chamber was set aside and sealed, and named with a number rather than a saint. Inside it, the librarius and a handful of sergeants built a syllabus that did not look like scripture. It taught breathing as a weapon and stillness as a blade, and how to move in a way that made power remember. It served the hand and not the appetite. Some called it heresy, until it saved their lives, and then they called it practical. Custodian wardens visited as if by accident and stood in the shadows, while recordings of Goku's training played on walls the size of parade grounds. Constantin Valdor listened without speaking, and at the end said only, "Teach this to men who will never lie to themselves." The Grey Knights argued in the quiet of their fortress monastery, where argument is a sacrament, and Justicar Thorn spoke for caution, while a younger brother asked whether strength that refuses cruelty might be a shield of its own. They did not resolve it. They set the question in their hearts and let it sharpen them. In the cold places of the void, a splinter of the great devourer tasted a world that should have been easy and found its feeder tendrils cut by ultramarines, who moved a half-step cleaner and struck a half-beat sooner, and the whole battle line felt different as if music had been tuned. On Mordian, the green tide kept a perimeter like a dog around a yard, because the knob with the welded arm said the boss gave an order, and orcs do not believe in disobedience. When the order makes the fights bigger, chaos arrived to test that line, and found laughter and fists and a crude discipline that refused to break. And Mortarion in the warp listened to the story of his banishment repeated by things that loved rot and hated light. And he remembered pain through the numbness, like a man dreams of warmth in snow. He began to practice a new cruelty. For a day, he promised himself would come. In the black libraries of the Thousand Suns, a sorcerer calculated the probability of an energy that did not taste of the warp, and his quill broke on figures that refused prophecy. He burned the page, and the numbers crawled away, unscorched, across the Imperium. Tales of the Golden Fighter moved by rumor and laughter, a mess hall myth. The Inquisition tried to nail them to proofs, and found that hope does not sit still. Sometimes the story said he had shattered a Daemon Primarch with a word. Sometimes it said he had caught an orbital strike in his hand and put it down gently. Always it ended with a choice that protected the small against the great, and men who had never met him stood differently after hearing it. Gilliman wrote letters he did not send to a father who could not read them, and they were about the utility of a morality that refuses to be convenient. He approved a handful of changes that made small things kinder, in places where it would not break the line, and pretended it was nothing. Inquisitor Vale received a sealed cogitator spool from a Forge world adept who owed her his career, and inside were the schematics of a device that would never again be built. She locked it in a vault no one prayed to, and sat outside it for an hour, listening to the ship breathe. Sometimes at night on Macragge, the wind came down from the mountains in a particular way, and the training halls remembered a man moving like clean water, and the auspex would register a fluctuation that had no category, and a novice would feel brave without knowing why. Elsewhere beneath auroras and the sound of water on stone, Vegeta trained into a silence that felt like respect, and the sky above him had stars that were only stars and that still mattered. Bulma built a new machine and then dismantled it because she did not like the direction its math smiled at her. Gohan wrote a paper about realms of thought and their interaction with living will, and filed it where no one graded it. Goten asked his father what gods want, and Goku said, "They want what people want, only louder. And that is why you must decide what you are before they decide it for you." Back in the Dark Millennium, a chaplain of the Black Templars told recruits a censored version of the tale, and could not hide the way one sentence pulled a splinter from his chest as he spoke it. On a shrine world, a child drew a picture of a man in orange, giving a flower to a sister of battle, and the picture was confiscated and later framed in a private room by someone who did not have words for the ache it mended. In a hidden conclave of the Ordo Malleus, a prognosticator stared into a pool that reflected futures and saw a fist of light punching a hole in a maze. And he laughed until he cried, because sometimes blasphemy is just a name we give to an exit. Deep in the warp, Tzentia rebuilt the architecture that had torn when a mortal chose an anchor no equation had weighted properly. The god told itself new stories about control and changed its mind in 3 directions at once. It sent a whisper to a sleeper on a forge world, and the man woke with his hands empty and his head full of a design he could no longer remember. And for the first time in years, he slept through the next night. The legend settled, not as a law, but as a habit in the muscles of a civilization. Commanders paused before ordering fire on cities and asked the hard question about cost. A sergeant on a dying moon chose to talk, and a riot became a ceasefire long enough for evacuation. A squad of Sisters of Battle stood shoulder to shoulder with Xenos for 6 minutes against a greater hell, and called it tactical necessity, and prayed later for forgiveness they did not need. Goku's absence became a presence made of choices other people made, because they remembered, and on a day that does not have a date, yet somewhere in the long book of war. A green-skinned starship will cut from the void over a world that has already bled, and the ramp will drop and a war boss in new plates will stomp down laughing, bigger and older, and with a scar on his chest he is proud of. And he will bellow for the yellow boss and promise him a fight that will ring mountains. Somewhere else, a silver circle will feel that shout, and a blue line will tighten buckles, and a woman in black will close her eyes and decide to trust a memory. And in another universe, a man will look up from a field where his sons are sparring and feel a tug in the chest that is not danger and not command, but friendship. And he will smile and go back to teaching the smallest one how to turn a punch into a promise. The faceless narrator you hired to tell this will end by saying that in the grim darkness where there is only war, a rumor can be a map, a breath can be a weapon, and a single clean refusal can throw a god's plan out of rhythm. And then he will let the last shot sit on the image of a ruined banner stirred by a new wind and a crater filling with rain and the tiny sound of someone somewhere laughing like he means it. In the months that followed, the galaxy learned to carry the idea of him like a coin in the pocket that you touch without thinking when the night gets long. Some worlds pressed a crude sign of a spiked sun into door lintels with a thumbprint of soot. Not worship, just a superstition against despair. In scholars across Ultramar, a new drill took root quietly between marksmanship and field dressings. A breath seized for 4 counts to settle the hands. A step that wastes nothing. A strike that ends without anger. Instructors called it practical, and recruits called it strange. Until it saved them, and then they called it ours. A scout sergeant on Kalth taught his neophytes to listen with their feet as they crossed a silent manufactorum, because monsters teach lessons as well as masters. And the floor told them where a genestealer waited, They lived because of a weight shift. On a shrine moon, a sister of battle reassured a line of civilians by squaring her shoulders in a way that made her look a little like a story, and the crowd steadied itself enough to board the landers without breaking. On Mordian, the knob with the welded arm kept the horde inside borders by telling them the boss said real fights lived beyond the plague lines, and that squishies were for mopping up when the songs were over. And for the first time in living memory, Imperial commanders wrote plans around orc predictability and slept. Not well, but sometimes. The Grey Knights debated in their cold sanctums, where logic and faith share a table. And Thorn placed a gauntlet on a lectern and said that power unruled is a rot, but power that refuses cruelty may serve the throne. And a younger knight said, maybe the Emperor's will includes men who will not make a pile of innocents into a stair, and their chaplain said, choose your words with care, and then did not strike them for saying it because somewhere a demon remembers a fist of light. The Mechanicus consecrated new dogma that outlawed intimacy between certain frequencies and certain lattice structures, and a Forge World Primus reduced 3 temples to their foundations without trial, because tiny errors are how gods make homes inside machines. Inquisitor Vale earned enemies for refusing to call a miracle a heresy by reflex, and earned allies who did not admit it for calling a heresy, even when it looked like a miracle, and her reports began to carry a sentence that commanders read twice. Evaluate intent before category. Gilliman signed small permissions that made small mercies legal in sectors that could bear it, and it changed the temperature by a ½ degree. In places where the air had been knives, he said nothing when an old admiral quoted a line he had not written aloud: fight only where the cause is just. And on nights when the Strategium slept in shifts, he allowed himself the smallest human luxury of imagining a conversation that would never happen between his father and a man who loved to train. In the warped Sintash, stitched the tear where the concept of home had slipped through its fingers and invented new caution and new appetite in equal measures. It sent dreams to a sculptor of fates in a sapphire tower to tempt him into building another door, and then broke his hands in a different dream before he could accept, because change remains useful only when it is yours. Nurgle tended a little jar of light he had tried to keep after the banishment, and watched it refuse to go out, and laughed, and told it a bedtime story about endings. Khorne heard the echo of a clean duel on Mordian, and looked away with something like contempt and something like respect. And Slanesh sighed because pleasure without corruption can taste like dignity, and that is a flavor even gods cannot unlearn. Meanwhile, on an agri world that had forgotten its name during the last tithe, a boy found a cracked slate with a sketch of a man in orange catching a falling Valkyrie, and he practiced drawing straight lines until the sketch looked right, and then he kept practicing until other lines looked right. And 40 years later, a mural on a hab block showed an Astartes and a miner standing back to back, and the miner had his knees bent correctly, and the Astartes looked like a person instead of a statue. The ecclesiarchy tried to decide whether to burn it, and then did not, and no one wrote down why. A Black Legion champion knelt in a shrine of knives and promised a god he would find the golden fighter and bring his head. And when he rose from the prayer, he discovered that what he wanted most was not the head, but the fight, and he hated himself for the honesty. Constantine Valdor watched a training circle where sergeants taught balance to children who would one day be giants, and he did not speak to them because the past is already crowded. But when he turned to leave, he nodded as if to appear out of respect for the way a foot found the floor. On the rim, a rogue trader flew a course that should have been a grave and came home with her crew intact, because at the worst moment, her helmsman remembered to breathe for 4 counts and not 3, and the ship threaded a needle made of mathematics and debris and courage. Rumors multiplied like stray cats aboard void ships. Some said the Golden One would return at the head of a host of lights that did not flicker. Some said he had already returned 3 times disguised as a dock worker, a pilgrim, and a condemned man. Vale filed the rumors where they belonged, and then reread 2 of them and frowned and put them in a second file that did not have a label. Tigurius dreamed of a maze that was also a bruise, and woke with a word that is not a word, sitting in his mouth tasting like cold iron and honey. And he wrote it down and burned the paper, and forgot it, and kept the ash, because even forgetting has a shape. On a nameless rock in the halo stars, a warp shimmer spit out a shard of a world that had belonged to no category, and an Adeptus cartographer's team went down in hazard suits and came back with a photograph of a footprint that looked human and did not weigh what it should have weighed. And the manufactorum that weighed the photo went silent for a week, back where skies are blue, for reasons other than worship. Goku sat on a hill with Gohan and Goten and told them a story without names about a soldier who was also a king who had forgotten he could be a father, and about a woman whose job was to ask hard questions and protect the answers, and about a giant who laughed like a drum and respected a clean punch, and he said that strength is not a license, it is a promise. And they nodded like boys who would one day remake those words to fit their lives. Bulma asked him once in the quiet between projects if he missed it, and he said he missed the work and the people who did it in a place that wanted to eat them. And she touched his shoulder and said, the work is everywhere, and the eating is everywhere too. And he laughed and went back to training, because laughter and training are the same answer sung in two keys. Sometimes in the middle of a sparring match, he would move a certain way and feel a drag on his kai that was not there. And smile, because even absence can be a teacher. Sometimes very far away, Gilliman would be reading a brief and look up without knowing why, and then go back to the page with his mouth set a fraction kinder. Years later, on Mordian, an orc boy with a dented helm painted yellow for luck would ask an old knob with a welded arm if the boss in the story was real, and the old orc would say stories fight better than facts, and then add quieter that yes, he had seen a human move like a comet, and that it had made him want to punch the sky, and that nothing had ever been better in a sealed vault on a forge world, an unsleeping machine. Spirit hummed a note that matched the resonance of a gate that must not be built. An Inquisitor Vale ordered, the vault moved to a different star without telling anyone why, and slept for 3 hours without dreaming, and in places that cannot be mapped because they are not places, but arrangements of, will the Chaos Gods rearrange their games to account for a variable named refusal? And the board groaned, and the pieces learned new ways to be patient and reckless at once. The faceless narrator who has been your mouth in all of this will end here, as the camera drifts over a battlefield that is only a field again. Grass has returned in stubborn threads across old glass, and the crater is a lake with dragonflies and children who are told not to swim too far, but do and come back laughing. A broken banner lies under clear water, and the fabric moves like a fish, and the sun finds gold in the silt in a way that makes you think of hair and light, and a punch that said no to a god. And the voice will say that in the grim darkness where there is only war, a clean choice can travel farther than a fleet and last longer than a monument. And that sometimes the strongest thing in a universe that eats saints is a hand set gently on a weapon that could kill. And the words "not today," and then the shot will hold 1 second longer than comfort before it cuts to black so the echo has time to land. The legend kept working in places where orders could not reach. On a mining moon where the veins were nearly empty, a strike broke before it began because a foreman remembered to drop his voice and square his stance. And the men who were about to throw rocks saw strength that did not threaten and chose a meeting instead. On an ice world, a column of refugees was about to freeze in the night between habs, when a sister hospitaller taught a breathing cadence to 1,000 people at once. And their panic slowed, and the heat of bodies saved lives that credits could not. In the fortress monasteries of several chapters, a quiet experiment took root without name. Veteran sergeants drilled forms that made young giants feel the floor as if it were an ally rather than a victim. And after 6 weeks, the training logs showed fewer broken wrists and more clean kills. And a chaplain who had called it softness first called it stewardship, and did not apologize because he was too old to waste breath on pride. An artisan of the Adeptus Mechanicus on Riser proved by demonstration that a certain pattern of oscillation in a void shield harmonics reduced catastrophic failure by a margin too small for doctrine to celebrate and too large for commanders to ignore. And she cited a recording of a golden aura as her inspiration, and her Margos told her to remove that line. And she did, and kept a copy at home. In the Librarius of the Ultramarines, Tigurius refined a protocol for psychic shielding that married stillness to litany, and his apprentices reported less noise from the warp during manifestations, as if something at the edge of the storm respected a clean mind. Inquisitor Vale pursued a thread through Forge World audits and found that the tech priest who had altered the gateway schematics had been erased so thoroughly that even his failures had been reassigned to other names. And she stood in an empty cogitator chapel, listening to the tick of cooling metal, and promised aloud to a room that did not believe in promises that she would learn how many hands had guided his corruption, and one of the hands far away paused over a different sin without knowing why, in the eye of terror. A council of things that could not agree on colour agreed on annoyance, and Cinch pretended the insult had been instructional, while hiding a calculation that ended in a remainder named resentment. Nurgle let spores drift that would germinate in decades to test whether joy could be trained into a plague. If you were patient with it, Khorne sharpened a prophecy on his teeth and decided that the next time the yellow aura lit a battlefield, it would be somewhere red already, and that would be acceptable. Slaanesh tuned a choir to the exact pitch of longing and wondered who would hear it across the walls between worlds. On the far rim, a Necron tomb world woke incorrectly, and its first scouting phalanx stepped into the path of a rogue trader convoy. And the ambush should have been perfect, but the convoy helmsman had trained his crew in the slow breath and the hard turn, and they cut between firing lines like a needle through silk and lived, and the Necrons recalculated with a patience only stars usually have. On a night world, a young pilot, who had inherited a carapace and a grief the same day, met a tyrannid spearhead in the saddle of his throne, and almost gave in to the need to charge screaming until he remembered a voice describing a fist that did not waste itself, and he waited a second, and then two, and then stamped, and the perfect counterturn made a kill that began his legend and kept 3 villages standing. Aboard the phalanx, a company of Imperial fists watched archival footage of a man catching blows as if he were building a wall out of air, and a senior captain closed the file and told his squad that sometimes endurance is a strike, and the younger men pretended they had always known that. On Mordian, a mech discovered that if he timed a generator to the rhythm of the chant "New Boss" and then pretended he had not, it ran cleaner and louder, and he painted a glyph that looked like a laughing sun on the casing and said it was ugly and refused to wash it. In the quiet core of the Imperium, a High Lord who had never been contradicted read a report from Vale that used the word intent without sarcasm, and found himself looking at a window for the first time in months and not seeing a city, but instead a table with cups on it, and he did not know what to do with that softness. So he signed a directive that changed nothing important and felt worse afterward in a way that might one day save a life. In a hidden collegium of the Ordo Malleus, a debate ended with a vote to classify refusal as a vector that demons could not easily corrupt, and several old men laughed at their own blasphemy and then wrote a prayer that asked for the courage to stop hitting when the enemy was not the problem. In the depths of terror, a custodian read 3 lines of a transcript of Goku's conversation with Gilliman and smiled in a way that would have terrified anyone who recognized it, because it looked almost like relief. On Macraggy, the sealed chamber with the number for a name hosted a spa where a veteran sergeant and a young librarian explored the scene between bodycraft and mindcraft, and both came away humbled and better, and said nothing in public beyond the word useful. Somewhere, very far, a small warp eddy curled around a memory of a fist of light and settled into a stable pattern that Imperial navigators could not see but sometimes benefited from. As if storms sometimes remember mercy. On a shrine world, where statues learn to ignore prayers, a single candle burned longer than wax can account for, beside an ex-voto painting of a man in orange, giving water to an old soldier, and the attendant priest snuffed it and it did not go out, and he did not report it, because not everything that helps needs to be written down to be true. In a port that smelled of iron and salt, an unregistered ship came in with a crew that had tattooed a tiny laughing sun on their wrists, and the dockmaster wrote it off as fashion and did not think about the way fights broke out less. Around that berth, Gilliman worked through the mountain of war and administration and stopped at a message from an agri prefect who had used initiative to save his people and asked for forgiveness rather than permission, and the Primarch wrote back with permission rather than forgiveness, and the prefect framed the reply and used it to bend a governor into decency. Inquisitor Vale received a second sealed spool with no sender and found inside a fragment of a homeworld starfield, imprinted on a wafer of unknown alloy, and when she held it, the room sounded briefly like children running on stairs, and she put it in the same vault as the forbidden plans, not because it was dangerous, but because it felt like company and she was not ready to share it. Togurius dreamed again of a maze, and this time there was a hole in it, shaped like a hand, and he put his own hand against it and woke with tears on his face, and no shame. The Orc warboss Grimto woke at last on Mordian with a headache the size of a battle wagon, and laughed because his ribs hurt in the way that proves a story, and he told his knob with the welded arm to keep the lads mean but fair. And then he went out and punched a plague drone out of the air, and the wah sang about yellow light while they stomped, and it made a better beat. And in the universe where skies turn gold for weather instead of worship, Goku stood in a field that smelled like cut grass and listened to his sons breathe as they slept under a tree, and he felt the pull in his chest. That means a friend is thinking of you somewhere, and he did not need to know the name to smile. He lifted his eyes to the dark and said quietly to no one and everyone that he would come if he was needed, and that he hoped he would not be, because peace is the best training partner and far away in halls of stone. And Data, the Lord of Ultramar, paused for an instant over a ledger of war, and then signed his name with a pressure lighter by a hair, and that hair's difference ran along orders and rides and rifles until it reached a child who did not have to run today. This is how the idea of a man becomes a tool that fixes small breaks so that great ones never happen. And this is how a universe that says there is only war finds itself wrong for an hour at a time. Enough to keep a door unlocked in the mind for what comes next, and enough to make an outro worth speaking. This is where the voice goes quiet, though the world does not, where the camera pulls back and the sound of war becomes weather, and the weather becomes breath, and the breath becomes a promise. The story you asked for ends, but the work it taught keeps walking. Remember the shape of it, because shapes outlive names. A man fell into a universe that eats saints and chose to be hungry for better instead of full of power. He asked questions before he threw punches, and when he threw them clean. He broke a Primarch not for glory, but to keep strangers alive. And then he told an army that strength was not a license. And they listened because truth delivered without cruelty carries farther than orders. He stood between silver and green and said, "Wait." And both sides paused long enough for a different future to breathe. He spoke to a lord carved from duty and traded conditions instead of kneeling, and the lord accepted because reason is a weapon too. He walked into a god's house and was offered a throne made of other people's choices, and he left by a door only he could make because home is stronger than hunger. He returned to his field and his sons, and that is not smaller than slaying a demon. It is larger because it is what slaying a demon is for. And now the galaxy he touched remembers him, the way muscle remembers a fall and corrects the next step. You will hear mess hall jokes about a man in orange and a fist of light, and some will call it heresy, and some will call it a fairy tale. And none of that matters, because what matters is that a sergeant will hold his fire for one heartbeat and save a street, and an inquisitor will test intent before category, and a Primarch will sign an order with a fraction more mercy, and an orc will swing at the right enemy for the right reason, and a child will draw a hero who bends his knees to listen. This is how legends pay rent, not by monuments, but by habits they leave behind in hands and hearts. If you ask what it meant, inside the math of a war, too big for anyone. Life, the answer, is simple and hard. It meant that refusal is a vector, that saying no to corruption loudly and yes to responsibility quietly moves lines on maps and years in books. It meant that power, which will not be cruel, can still be absolute authority over the only kingdom that matters, which is the self. It meant that hope is not a mood, it is a method, and methods replicate. So when the lights dim in the strategium, and the Vox traffic slows to a tired hiss, and the last line of the day's orders falls into the archive, the echo that remains is not applause, it is instruction. Breathe for 4. Step without waste. Strike without hate. Ask if the cause is just. Protect the small first. Aim the loud at the loud. And when a god offers a shortcut, remember the long way is the only road that arrives. If you are the kind of watcher who counts endings, this one is tidy enough to sleep on. The ring is gone. The breach is sealed. The Primarch keeps his watch. The Inquisitor keeps her list. The Greenskins keep their song. The Grey Knights keep their ward. The Mechanicus keeps its vault. The people keep their lives one more day at a time. Somewhere under a bluer sky, a father keeps training and 2 boys keep growing, and that is victory measured properly. But if you are the kind of watcher who lives for continuations, know this too. The board is set with a new piece called memory, and it moves in ways no codex predicted. There will be nights when the warp leans against doors and finds them braced by men who were not there before this story taught them how. There will be days when a commander chooses the harder mercy and the casualty report shrinks by a column and no one knows why, and that not knowing is a holy thing. There will be a battle where laughter rings from green throats while silver prayers cut the air and both songs aim at the same wound, and for 6 minutes the galaxy behaves as if it were worth repairing. And there will be a place without a name, yet where the sky tears and something vast steps through, and a voice in gold answers, not today, and means it. This is your outro, so take the last image with you when the screen goes black. A ruined banner under clear water, grass stitching a scar, giant footprints filling with rain until they look like lakes that caught the shape of a stride. A fortress at dawn with one window lit because someone is still working and will not stop. A field where 2 boys spar and a man laughs and corrects their stance. And in another universe, a Primarch smiles once without witnesses and signs a kinder war. The narrator leaves you here with the only call to action that fits the setting we share. Carry the habit, not the hymn. Carry the breath, not the brand. Carry the refusal like a tool, and use it when the easy answer asks you to look away. And when the next crossover asks what happens if another impossible stranger lands in the 41st millennium, you already know the first line. The sky tore open, and something bright fell. And everyone learned what it means to stand, fade on that knowledge, hold one beat longer than comfort, cut to black.